Why does the Labour Party struggle to win elections? Well, welcome back, everyone. I've been away a while, haven't uploaded in a while, but I thought better upload a video because, time's right, and we've got this Labour Party leadership contest going on. So I wanted to kind of look into policies more specifically and find out what it would take for the Labour Party to win an election again. So what I've done is I've looked at the manifestos of every election since Ramsay Mcdonald became leader of the Labour Party, because he was the first Labour Prime Minister. And I've looked at various statistics like the overall majority, their swing towards the Labour Party, whether they won or lost that election, and what the end result of that election was. So even if they lost seats, for example, they might have still had a majority because they had a majority to begin with. And I've kind of put that data together, and I've ordered the manifestos based on seat losses and seat gains. Why have I done that? Well, because we have a first past the post election system, and therefore election popularity isn't necessarily determined by voter swing, because a policy might be popular amongst the whole country, but if you can't convert that policy into seats, then it's proof that the policy or the person delivering that policy isn't as popular in specific geographical areas where the Labour Party need to focus on. Now, I know elections aren't just about policies. You've got the leader, the mood of the country, the reputation of the Labour Party, the alternative leader, tactical voting, and other factors that people vote on during elections. And that's why the data is so muddled up, because sometimes you might have a Labour Party winning with a manifesto that promises to nationalise everything, and other times you might have a Labour Party winning with a manifesto that promises free markets on everything. So I wanted to get to the bottom of which was better, to go down this right-wing route of kind of Tony Blair-esque free markets and being pro-defence, or this more kind of Jeremy Corbyn style route, being very pacifist and nationalist and very, very left-wing. Which is better? There's a lot of debate on Twitter going on at the moment about which side of the argument we should go towards. Obviously, we know that Tony Blair is still not popular within the country at the present time. We also know that Jeremy Corbyn is not popular within the country at the present time, as proven by the election. So which side should they swing towards? Let's start by looking at transport, because we've had HS2 coming up, and we've had a lot of problems regarding the railway lines. And I thought, let's look back into the past at previous Labour Transport Manifesto promises. Some of them are a bit vague and not very inspiring, and like power, transport, iron and steel as public services, promised by Arthur Henderson. He lost 235 seats. Gordon Brown was perhaps the first person to promise a high-speed rail line, so more kind of free market thinking investment in the current existing transport system, but he still lost 97 seats. Clement Attlee said ever better service to industry and passengers. Harold Wilson wanted to expand and modernise our whole transport system. Michael Foot wanted a national transport authority. Jeremy Corbyn in 2019 wanted public ownership. Again, he still lost 60 seats. James Callaghan wanted to maintain the present rail network and invest into the future. Still lost 50 seats. Tony Blair, by 2005, had gone away from this more kind of free market thinking and more into kind of socialist thinking. He wanted devolution, so that the regional authorities had more power over regional networks, rails and buses and roads. Still lost in 48 seats. Ramsay Mcdonald wanted national ownership, minus 40 seats. Ed Miliband wanted more public control, lost 26 seats. Clement Attlee, no mention on transport. Hugh Gatesell, he wanted road haulage will be renationalised. Clement Attlee, public ownership of the steel and road haulage industries. these are the kind of policies that we can expect would be safe bets. So not necessarily election winners, not necessarily election losers, but policies that you can put on your manifesto as a way to kind of fill it up a little bit without taking away your election success. Harold Wilson wanted a move from road to rail, so this environmental theme seems to prove popular with the general public. He also wanted to discourage the building of urban motorways, and he was quite popular with those policies. Neil Kinnock wanted a safer transport policy. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to bring private rail companies back into public ownership. So again, that public ownership idea, still very popular, depending on when the election is and who the person delivering that message is. Neil Kinnock was the first to mention a high-speed rail network, which was Tory party policy and Labour Party policy this last election. Harold Wilson wanted to expand the road programme. Ramsay Mcdonald wanted the development of transport by road. Harold Wilson in 1964 wanted to improve and modernise the existing service. Clement Attlee, with a very different kind of policy, wanted public ownership. Ramsay Mcdonald wanted reorganisation of the existing services. Tony Blair wanted to improve the existing services, whereas Clement Attlee wanted public ownership. So that you can see the difference. Both are pretty much popular depending on the time. So after the war, when a lot of UK's infrastructure was destroyed because of the bombings, public ownership and investing in new infrastructure was popular. I'll get onto why Clement Attlee was most particularly popular later, and why his policies perhaps aren't as popular today under Jeremy Corbyn. Tony Blair, meanwhile, wanted to improve the current situation along with Harold Wilson. So which is more popular? Well, if you take the averages, pro-nationalising the railway networks would lose you about minus 0.1 seats. Investing in the existing system, meanwhile, would gain about 5.3 seats. Not an election-changing issue, but an issue that could bolster a manifesto. If you take into account that the next election, the Labour Party is going to have to gain over 100 seats just to get a majority, then you want to be going for these pro-investment policies. But of course, as we'll come on to later, investing money means taxing people from somewhere to get that money, and taxing people necessarily isn't very popular, especially with the Labour Party's reputation with the economy. If you don't generate revenue for your economy, then you can't generate the tax revenue to be able to pay for these public services. HS2, most recently announced by the Tory party, has proved to be quite an unpopular policy. But likewise, so was Jeremy Corbyn in the last election, who promised national ownership of the railway networks. So we'll move on to perhaps one of the most contentious issues within the Labour Party and within the country at the moment, and that's the issue of immigration, because it revolves around Brexit. So you'll notice a lot of blank manifestos regarding the word immigration, and that's simply because they failed to mention the word immigration back in the olden days. Perhaps it wasn't an issue, or perhaps the Labour Party didn't dare or didn't care to talk about it. But the more recent election manifestos have dared to talk about it. Gordon Brown, in 2010, said, "We see rising employment and wages, not rising immigration, but we reject the arbitrary and unworkable Tory quota." So pro-migration, pro-letting people in. Harold Wilson talked about immigration, but also talked about it alongside securing good race relations. Michael Foot wanted to liberalise the age limit criteria for children and the criteria for elderly parents and their other relatives. James Callaghan said that our whole immigration and citizenship law needs revision. Ed Miliband said that immigration has made an important contribution, but it needs to be properly controlled. So these more kind of right-leaning, controlling type policies. Tony Blair said that immigration has been good for Britain and that they wanted to keep it that way. Harold Wilson, meanwhile, wanted to review the law of nationality. Neil Kinnock wanted firm and fair immigration. Jeremy Corbyn wanted a system built on human rights. Harold Wilson wanted to continue, that's that word again, continue realistic controls. That's that other word. He said in 1964 that it must be limited, but the Labour government will retain immigration control. Tony Blair said that he wanted a crackdown on the fraudulent use of birth certificates. So I wanted to kind of average out what happens when a Labour manifesto uses this more kind of conservative language: crackdown, control, review, be firm, versus what happens if the Labour Party manifesto uses this more kind of liberal language. Words like human rights and liberalise and retain and fairness and openness. And does it fare the Labour Party better if they mention this kind of language, or if they're more firm on immigration? And I actually found that pro-immigration, pro-liberalisation, or keeping things the same mentions got an average, if I group them together, of minus 8.3 seats. Whereas language in their manifesto that was more kind of pro-restrictive had an average gain of 8.5 seats. Whereas not mentioning immigration at all had an average of 7.6 seats. So in other words, they're better off not mentioning immigration at all than they are being pro-liberalisation and pro-keeping things the same, or, pro-migrant in elections. Now, well, it's very hard when you have an issue like Brexit, where a majority of the electorate back in 2016 voted to leave the EU, and one of those promises as part of leaving the EU was controlling our borders. And then you have the Labour Party, who secretly, or have always, wanted to liberalise or keep things pretty similar in favour of minority communities and in favour of kind of race inclusion and things that they stand for as a party, as a brand. But then you've also got this other side of Labour in the north of England, in those constituencies that vote to leave the EU, that want to see Labour going towards this more pro-restriction, pro-controlling immigration narrative. And that's why they're kind of struggling. But it's also to do with the economy. Let's get onto the economy as an issue, because that's been mentioned. So Arthur Henderson, back in 1931, wanted to improve the efficiency of our agricultural, transport, coal and other chief industries. Gordon Brown wanted long-term investment. Clement Attlee wanted to increase production and maintain our present standard of life. Harold Wilson said that our central aim was steady and sustained increase of output. Michael Foot wanted to increase spending. Jeremy Corbyn in 2019 was all about a green industrial revolution, putting climate change issue and the economic issue together as one. James Callaghan wanted freedom to determine our own budgetary policy and control our own currency. Tony Blair wanted to see a modern growing trade unions as part of society and our economy. So by 2005, Tony Blair was kind of moving away from this more kind of conservative free market thinking in favour of a more kind of socialist economy that favours trade unions and workers' rights and the nationalisation of employment. And can I also say that the 2005 manifesto specifically boasted about Labour's record with the economy and the boom that was going on at the time. Of course, when 2008 and the banking crisis happened, that all fell apart and once again destroyed the reputation of the Labour Party as being competent with the economy. And that's been a huge problem for the Labour Party, is that every time that they've been in power, generally there has been some kind of economic recession or economic crisis or some kind of strikes that happened, maybe not as a direct result of them, but certainly when they're in power. Ramsay Mcdonald wanted national ownership, whereas Ed Miliband wanted to raise tax revenues and control social security spending. Clement Attlee said he wanted to reduce taxation. So you've got those two sides of Labour: reduce taxation of wages for the poor, raise tax revenues for the rich, basically steal from the rich, give to the poor. But of course, if you steal from the rich, you discourage business investment, you discourage all kinds of spending that could benefit the public sector as well as the private sector. Things like employment and industries like the transport system, like our NHS, like various other things. Also, you have the possibility of slowing down the economy. And if you slow down the economy, not only are you likely to create some kind of economic problem, the rise in inflation, the rise in the cost of living as wages are forced up because goods get more expensive, because trade unions are being supported to rise wages. But of course, to rise wages, you have to pay the employees more, which means the businesses who sell the products have to put more money on their products to be able to pay their employees more. And so that's why Labour always have problems with either the normal folk going out and buying their shopping, the poor folk who live on minimum wages, who work these low-skilled jobs, and the businesses who are there to try and make money and struggle to make money when the Labour Party are trying to make the wages of their employers higher than the profits of the company can be because of taxes. Which is where Tony Blair came in to say that hard work should be rewarded in a more kind of conservative way, and he won a lot of seats in 1997 as a result of seeming more economically competent. Of course, that all fell apart when it came to the economic crisis, and everybody realised that the Labour Party had actually spent so much that we didn't have any money to deal with the crisis. So those are the two sides of the Labour Party. You've either got encouraging business or taxing business and encouraging the small, low-paid worker. Tony Blair was all about globalism. Clement Attlee, after the war, said that economic strife and political insecurity are enemies of peace. So if you're wondering where this whole kind of anti-business, anti-corporation rhetoric comes from, and why the Tory party in particular are most scared of the Labour Party, it's because very much saw economic strife as the reason behind political disagreements. And if it weren't for capitalism, arguably, we wouldn't have environmental problems, and we wouldn't need a minimum wage, and we wouldn't need human rights laws, and we wouldn't need employment law, and we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that are still going on and are still being negotiated with regards to Brexit, and are still problems of today. But likewise, if it weren't for this kind of pro-liberal, pro-socialist political thinking, we wouldn't have strikes, and we wouldn't have all this red tape and bureaucracy that sort of gets in the way for businesses to be able to just simply make money as quickly, as well, and as efficiently as possible, and money that can eventually be invested in our home country. So which is more popular? Well, for this average, I took both the seat losses and gains and the swings, because I was kind of wondering what would happen if we had proportional representation. Obviously, people would vote differently. People would be more inclined to vote for the Lib Dems or the Brexit Party. But if, going on previous elections, if the swing towards the Labour Party equaled a gain in seats, then does that match the gains in seats from the first past the post system? And the answer is yes. So most people are against this kind of free market thinking, in favour of the low paid worker, in favour of raising minimum wages and investing in public services, taxing corporations. That's where the Labour Party benefit most. But of course, where they struggle the most is this anti-free market thinking, which means ultimately businesses are going to be less inclined to set up shop in the UK, and that means that the economy is likely to do less well, or growth is likely to slow or even slump in the case of a recession. And as we've seen before with the Labour Party, we're more likely to see economic decline. strikes, a deficit, ultimately less money for the next government to spend. And this is why the Labour Party can't or struggle to win elections, is because they can't both prove that they're economically competent and win seats through being anti-free market and promise all this spending in transport or housing and the NHS, and then say, how are you going to pay for it? Well, we're going to raise taxes on businesses because we're anti-free market. Well, how are you going to encourage investment into the UK? Well, yeah, that's going to be hard because we're going to be raising corporation tax a lot. But, we can do it because, we haven't done it before. I don't know, really. And that's why, it's apart from just Brexit and kind of woke politics, which we talked about before, that's why the Labour Party struggle the most. Now, it doesn't mean it can't be done, right? So after the war in 1945, the country was entirely, well, not entirely, but certainly scarred by the war itself. And the idea that the Labour Party could rebuild it and could create this nationally owned health service, which at the time was a really good idea because it meant that people could get health care without having to pay private fees for it. It meant that the burden of life in general was taken off of people and put into the hands of the state. And that's where the Labour Party can benefit the most, when there's a particular issue like employment where the Labour Party can take that burden off the public and put it into the hands of the state. But at the moment, employment is particularly high. There isn't really an issue in which the burden for the public, particularly in 2019, was on whether or not they trust the political system at all, and whether or not they trust the political system to deliver on their democratic vote, which was to leave the EU. And until the Conservative Party create another burden, which the Labour Party can gain from, they're unlikely to win an election. But do you think that the Conservative Party will create another burden, that low-paid workers will be persuaded to be able to be saved magically by the state? Or do you think that the Labour Party are always going to be the fantasy politics, the magic grandpa party? Join in the debate below and subscribe.